Let's be real for a second here. A soft landing is not going to happen. Check this out.
Our next guest says expect rates to stay, quote, higher for shorter. Joining us now, Canaccord Genuity's Tony Dwyer. Tony, it's great to have you on. What do you mean by that?
So Morgan, our whole case this year was that a soft landing economic scenario is the worst case scenario because it does create that higher interest rate environment. We've seen a 25% increase in rates on the long, intermediate, and long end just over the last since mid-September. That ensures a recession rather than debate whether you're going to go into one, because that spike means you're going to have that much more of a slowdown in economic activity. So at some point, the higher you go in rates, the quicker it's going to shut down economic activity and the faster it's going to create to the other side of the mountain in rates.
So you don't think a soft landing is in the cards?
No, I don't. It would be historically unique on the leading economic indicators, on money. There's so many different areas that I see, and I understand that the unemployment rate's still low, but it's 0.4% off the low. Anytime you've been 0.5% off the cycle low, it's been right before or in a recession. So I think, between now and the first quarter, we're going to be in an economic recession. Most stocks reflect it.
Personal story time. Saved well over $100,000 when we refinanced our home in 2021. Like I told you guys back then, at that time, interest rates were near zero. It was a no-brainer. We started with a 15-year loan at 3.7% and refinanced with a rate of 1.9%. Now our bank calls us all the time trying to push us into refinancing now. They're saying, oh, you can get cash. I'm telling them that I get cash by working and not going into debt. You know what I mean? You can definitely feel they're getting desperate these days. Student loans too. A lot of people are opting out of college degrees because they see it as a way to hook kids on decades of uncancelable debt before they can even get a chance to start their adult life. The Federal Reserve recently raised interest rates to a 22-year high range of 5.25% to 5.5%, and an increase that will be felt by businesses and consumers alike. Though inflation has come down significantly in recent months, it's still above the Fed target rate of 2%. But I don't know, guys. Some analysts think that the latest interest rate hikes was unnecessary, especially considering the lag effect the previous 10 consecutive rate hikes over the last year may have made already on the economy. Now, sure, it looks like the Fed is looking to slow but not stop its aggressive approach to inflation. But like always, Powell refused to send a strong message, a strong signal about the Fed's strategy heading into the final months of the year, including whether another rate hike might be on the way in their November meeting. Instead, what we got is the usual Fed line about basing their decision on the data. Still, there's an overall optimism among economists about a soft landing. And let's be real, guys, the optimism might not be consistent with what's happened over historical inflationary episodes, including in the early 1980s. But it's true that the circumstances seem different this time around. The pandemic caused massive supply issues that caused significant economic volatility, but not the kind of inflation credit cycle dynamics that we've usually seen in other recessions. Ideal scenario should be the U.S. avert a recession. It likely means that any interest rate cuts won't happen until June of 2024. But if we do see a recession later this year or early next year, you could probably expect the Fed to quickly change their tune like they always do. And really, you don't have to look very hard for red flags in our economy right now. The dealer I bought my car from just announced that they're closing their doors on November 30th after 70 years in business. It's really sad. There's such a great place with employees that actually looked forward to getting my vehicle serviced there. They're better than anywhere around here. I think most of the guys can relate. Seeing stores closing and people losing their jobs definitely sounds like a recession to me. What do you guys think? If I were you, I would definitely make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We got to stick together, guys. One financial freedom fam right here on YouTube. And hey, don't forget to show this video some love. Light up the like button so that we can get through those tricky YouTube algorithms. Thank you so much, you guys. Now, with the Fed being uncertain with every step they take, I thought it would be a good time to look back and really see the messy, true story of what happened last time we beat inflation. What do you guys say? I mean, since the peak of the last inflation crisis back in the 1970s, the officials in charge of our central banks, those who are just all too intent on giving some harsh medicine to the economy, it's like the American people have just been mindlessly following them around. So the Fed and other central banks around the world have held an almost godlike influence over our economic well-being. Fed Chair Jerome Powell in particular finds himself in the shadow of the late Paul Volcker, one of the most legendary figures whenever we talk about controlling inflation. Those who are wary of rising inflation want Powell to take a page out of Volcker's book, copy what the senior banker did back in 1979, and hike up interest rates to the point where they stifle demand, even if it means going through a severe recession. let's not forget that Volcker's interest rate increases triggered the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression in the early 1980s. But eventually, things turned around, leading to what we call the Great Moderation, over 3 decades of inflation staying low while economic growth returned. In 2022, Powell's Federal Reserve raised interest rates throughout the year, and it seemed that they're following Volcker's approach. But they seem to be overlooking a lot of context in what happened. It doesn't explain just why inflation not only dropped, but also stayed down. Central bankers can definitely create a sudden credit shortage, but they can't necessarily address more complex issues like whether workers have the legal means to demand higher wages. They also can't construct systems and infrastructure that enhance productivity and make goods more affordable. These things take decades of investment and coordination. In simpler terms, what Volcker did was just part of a bigger deflationary strategy. This strategy also involved undermining labor unions and setting up a global supply chain to keep labor, components, and commodity costs in check. Right now, those options outside the realm of monetary policy aren't readily available. While wages have gone up, unions aren't the primary focus behind those pay increases anymore. The global supply chain, which used to give us inexpensive imports from all over the world, is now part of the problem as it's facing disruptions. The Fed might be able to limit credit to slow down investment and job creation, but it can't create the real-world political, legal, and logistical systems that, in the past, kept prices low even as the economy grew. So if we want to truly control prices, we can't turn off the money tap. We need a plan for concrete, long-term solutions to the scarcity of labor, commodities, and goods. The Fed has one main knob to turn to raise or lower the economy's temperature: interest rates. When the Fed raises the cost of borrowing money from the central bank, the rest of the financial system that ultimately provides credit to businesses and households raises its rates in turn, reducing the amount of money available to open new businesses, finance big new projects, or even buy homes. This is supposed to lead to fewer jobs, slimmer household budgets, and less confident workers making fewer demands to their bosses, slowing down spending and wage growth. Looking back to Volcker's time, as prices of gas shot up, workers began to ask for higher pay. This pushed their employers to raise prices in order to cover those increased wages, which in turn put pressure on consumers to request pay raises from their bosses. Now, I think you guys are all too familiar with this already, but this whole cycle is known as a wage price spiral, and it continued with no one daring to break the chain. And this wage price spiral in the 1980s was stopped mainly by undermining unions and creating labor policies that made it tougher to organize and bargain collectively. In other words, inflation might not always result from too much money chasing too few goods, as many mainstream economists suggest. It could be a byproduct of class conflict. When unions are weak, workers struggle to demand higher wages, even as the demand for labor increases. One study found that a loss of worker bargaining power reduced inflation fluctuations by a significant 87%, even without interventions like raising interest rates. The era of Volcker's shock and central bank independence coincided with Ronald Reagan's anti-union efforts, the rise of new Democrats like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, who were less supportive of organized labor compared to their predecessors, and the decline of union membership across nearly all industries except government. Volcker and his fellow central bankers understood how crucial union strength was in driving wage increases. The minutes of Federal Reserve meetings reveal how policymakers remained fixated on the role of unions in setting wages, even when many academic economists had moved on from the topic. While unions may be making some progress today, the national unionization rate, it's only half of what it was in 1983 when the Bureau of Labor Statistics started tracking it. Nowadays, instead of pushing for higher wages, unions might actually be restraining wage growth. They often negotiate long-term contracts that lock in pay for their members for years, regardless of changes in price levels. Wage increases are more influenced by factors like a wave of retirements that were bound to happen, new job opportunities driven by remote work, and a large number of people leaving lower-paying jobs in healthcare, retail, and food service. Now, despite all of the turbulence in the labor market, wages have not been a leading cause of inflation. They've actually been lagging behind the rising cost of living. So it's not clear that urging Powell to go full Volcker would address the current reasons for rising prices. If we want economic growth without inflation, we need to find new sources of labor, energy, and resources. Volcker's rate hikes also coincided with improvements to the supply chain. New logistics infrastructure, trade deals, and methods of inventory management allowed firms to get cheap commodities and components from the other side of the world astonishingly quickly. Globalization also made it easier for businesses to weaken unions because they could shift their factories to countries with weaker labor laws, essentially taking the wind out of the sails of labor leaders in developed economies. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating after the collapse of the Soviet Union, markets began to bring in what were previously communist countries with sizable, educated, yet underpaid workforces and pretty abundant natural resources. The establishment of global supply chains largely relied on a relatively stable geopolitical landscape, major world powers avoiding significant conflicts and generally supporting the idea of globalization. Now, sure, workers couldn't improve their working conditions or their pay. But if the stuff their wages bought got cheaper, then they would have less need to demand higher pay in the first place. As some economists have argued, inflation moderated when globalization increased imports and labor competition, not because investors had anchored expectations about central bank policy. It's this model of globalization that is currently breaking down, leading to volatile rising prices. Even though we're going through a period marked by surging prices and heated debates about energy, a lot like back in the 1970s, we also need to recognize that the specifics of our current inflation situation are definitely different than before. So this raises the question of whether the same methods that worked in the past will be effective in addressing today's price increases. We shouldn't want policymakers to repeat the same mistake of fighting the last war, you know what I mean? Relying just on central bankers to control inflation instead of continuing to prioritize investments in cost-effective renewable energy and urban development, or implementing policies that reverse the labor force shrinking since the pandemic could lead us down a path of accepting a future that's less prosperous and less resilient. And we definitely don't want that. Something to keep an eye on for our next update. What do you guys think?